Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Hopkins, and I coordinate the webinars for Hausman Johnson Insurance. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Impact of Cyber Breach Response, which will address the implications and fallout when a discovered breach happens to a business. Today's webinar will run the full hour and will be a discussion-based presentation with our panelists navigating multifaceted and engaging conversations. Also, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for review on the webinar archives of our website. You will receive a follow-up email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording. I would now like to introduce you to our Hausman Johnson presenter for today's webinar, David Cruz. David's goal is to encourage his clients to think about their business and their risk in new ways. As technology evolves and is implemented into more facets of life, more businesses are becoming tech businesses without even realizing it. His current area of expertise lies in ensuring technology risks and data-heavy clients, including software, health tech, and life science companies. He is also the leader of Hausman Johnson Insurance's Cyber Risk Work Group. Before becoming a client executive, David spent time at Hausman Johnson Insurance as a select lines associate, commercial lines associate, and a commercial account manager. Prior job experience in the banking industry instilled in David a high sense of urgency when a problem arises. He knows that until a problem is solved, clients are using valuable downtime that could be better spent running their business. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Cassie. I'm very excited to be here today and appreciate that wonderful introduction. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for attending this morning, both those that are attending live and those that will be viewing the webinar through a recorded version in the coming days and weeks here. To introduce myself a little bit, like Cassie said, I'm the technology risk consultant and the leader of Hausman Johnson Insurance's cyber practice. We've had a dedicated cyber insurance practice and cyber risk practice at our office for about 4 years or so, and I've been with that group almost the entire time right here. So within our firm, I carry my own book of business. I work with my own clients in the emerging technology space, health, IT, life sciences, software companies, and electronic and high-tech manufacturing is what I tend to focus on. And then beyond that, I work with all of our consultants and they work with real estate firms and hospitality, manufacturing, construction, and all points in between. And I usually go out and meet with those clients, with those consultants to discuss the cyber risks that are present in all of those businesses, because all of those businesses, if they're using computers and they have email and they have documents that they need to store and they're outsourcing their day-to-day functions into an online environment, they're adding risk to their lives, whether they necessarily realize it or not. So that's really what we want to dive into today, is how that risk sort of arises without us even realizing it, and some of the things that can happen when that's not managed properly here. So we've heard about cyber risk. It tends to be one of the buzziest of buzzwords that's out there these days. And there's a reason for that. The people are talking about it because it's a real event that happens to lots of businesses, certainly on front page news, on NBC Nightly News, but certainly right in our own area in Madison here too. We get calls almost every week from clients that have fallen prey to some sort of cyber attack, and we have to help guide them through that. So we've seen the real impact that these situations can have on businesses today. And we want to make sure that we can, help our clients get out of this situation as quickly and as intactly, if that's a word, as they possibly can. But ideally, if we can help prevent it on the front end by some measure, we want to aim to do that as well. So what we run into when we're doing this is that there are so many things that you can focus on in the cyber risk realm that it can almost seem like a paralysis by analysis situation, because every vendor, every product, every service, they're all competing for your attention, and they're all claiming to make you more secure. And it can be difficult to know where to start, and it can be difficult to know if you're doing the right thing. So we wanted to cut through that noise and give you just one thing to focus on, one idea that you can reach towards, that you can say, okay, if I'm at least moving towards this target, we're making progress, and we're going to be putting ourselves into a stronger security position. So what we're going to focus on today is incident response planning, because it is the number one thing you can do to reduce the cost of a data breach should one occur, and also one of the best things you can do to help understand your current environment and prevent bad things from happening. So the above table that we're looking at right here is from the most recent cost of a data breach study that was released by IBM Security and the Ponemon Institute. This annual study is the leading source of data breach cost information. In this year's study, they concluded that the average cost per record of a data breach is about $233 per record. Now that $233, that is made up of a variety of factors, both your direct costs for incident response, like your forensics IT, your legal costs, your public relations costs, but it also includes indirect costs, like lost business income, damage to your firm's reputation, things like that. So really, the reason, like I said, that we chose incident response planning is because by engaging in this sort of activity, it forces you to think about what is your current security posture? What weaknesses do we have? What strengths do we have that we can leverage? And it forces you to develop what-if plans to help you resolve network security incidences should they occur. But even within the incident response world, where do you start? How do you know if you've identified the right people that you'll need and the right services that you'll need at your disposal? What types of scenarios do you need to be preparing for? To help us unpack this topic, we've got representatives from 3 of the most critical services that you'll need at your side to help you respond to an incident: legal counsel, digital forensics, and crisis communications. To represent the legal voice, we have Eric Falk from ePlace Solutions. Eric is a licensed attorney in Pennsylvania and a certified information privacy professional. Prior to joining ePlace, Eric was a partner in the Chambers-ranked Privacy and Data Protection Department at Baker & Hostetler, LLP. While at Baker & Hostetler, Eric counseled clients who had experienced a data security incident in the healthcare, financial, retail, and professional fields. Eric has an electrical engineering background, and prior to practicing in the privacy and data protection area, spent over 15 years as an intellectual property attorney litigating patent, trade secret, and Computer Fraud and Abuse Act claims in federal court, and routinely advised clients on intellectual property matters. As the cyber risk practice manager for ePlace Solutions, Eric is responsible for the overall operations of ePlace's cyber risk management services. ePlace's cyber services minimize the risk of cyber attacks by working closely with policyholders to develop and implement sound cybersecurity practices through comprehensive online educational and guidance materials and extensive employee training. Eric, welcome and thank you for being here. Representing the digital, no problem. Thank you, Eric. Representing the digital forensics arm, we've got Nathan Little. Nathan is a partner with Gilware Digital Forensics. Nathan is a software engineer who specializes in full stack development and product design. Nathan has years of developing custom software to process large data sets related to data recovery, digital forensics, and electronic discovery, and distill them down into formats that are easily viewed by the target audience. Nathan is a member of the Association of Certified E-Discovery Specialists and is responsible for the design and implementation of Gilware's efficient e-discovery and digital forensics processes. Nathan's software development background allows him to combine existing digital forensics and e-discovery tools and custom-built software to produce more accurate results while reducing costs. Nathan, welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, David.
And finally, we have Steve Lyons, president of the SJL Government Affairs and Communications Group. Steve has nearly 30 years of experience in state and government politics, including as a former governor's deputy chief of staff, assistant deputy secretary of state, and chief policy advisor to Senator Scott Fitzgerald. As an experienced strategic communication and tactician, he has worked in depth on issues of commerce, venture investment, small business and economic development, insurance, financial institutions, and other business arenas. On behalf of his clients, Steve has worked on countless media campaigns and alongside many of the most influential elected officials and media officials today. He has done more than 300 interviews with international, national, and Wisconsin media, including interviews with Good Morning America, CNN, ABC World News Tonight, and the BBC. He's also served as the spokesperson for numerous individuals, corporations, and businesses as they attempt to work through the tumultuous times that follow a data breach. Steve, welcome. We're very excited to have you here today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I know I speak for all the participants on the webinar today that we can say that we're thrilled to have you all here. And I want to give each of you a bit of time to share with our participants what each of you do. I know I shared a little, bio background here, but I want our participants to hear it right from you. So what I'd like you to do is share a little bit about what each of you do, what your individual roles are during the planning and response phases of a network security breach. And as a way of introduction, tell us about the function you serve and why a business would need you on their team should a breach actually occur. So, Eric, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks, David. So my experience is actually both on the pre-breach and post-breach side. Currently, I do pre-breach work at D-Place Solutions. And what that means is we work with various companies to help them bolster their cybersecurity program to reduce their chances of a breach. So that involves everything from helping them build an incident response plan, implementing various cyber policies, email policies, access policies. We help them with business continuity plans, everything to reduce the risk of a cyber breach, including and probably most importantly, employee training. Training your employees is one of the biggest things you can do to reduce your risk of having a cyber breach. So that's what I do now. I've been with ePlace for about 18 months. Prior to that, as David mentioned, I was an attorney. I was what's called a breach coach. And in that capacity, we would represent policyholders. After experiencing a breach, we would help what they call quarterback the situation. We'd bring in forensics. We determine the scope of whatever infiltration happened. We determine if there was personally identifiable information that was compromised, and then we'd help the policyholder discharge whatever legal obligations arose out of that incident. Usually, it's notifying individuals if their information was compromised, and also notifying whatever governmental bodies needed to be notified after the breach. I think right now, I'm in a pretty good position to talk about both things that happened pre-breach and post-breach.
Okay, excellent, Eric. I'm sure we're gonna lean on you throughout this whole presentation, as we will all our panelists, to give some good insights into some of the legal and regulatory implications that businesses might face in that post-breach environment. Thank you. Nathan, how about you? What role does forensics IT play in breach response? And tell us, like I said, a little bit about why a business needs you by their side.
Yeah, so Gilware provides a wide range of services, and digital forensics and breach response is one of our main services that we offer. And the high-level goal, the two-sentence summary of what we do and why we're necessary is we specialize in finding the actual root cause of a breach. It's common that a breach or a security incident will have a root cause identified that's possibly the day before or a week before the incident actually occurred, but oftentimes the actual root cause of the breach is months previous, and the cause of the breach may stick around even after a company thinks that the breach and incident is dealt with. So that's kind of the first thing we do, is we figure out the exact root cause to prevent it from happening again. And then the bulk of our work, and arguably the more important specifically to the incident, is determining the exact actions of a human attacker that may be in a system, or the exact actions of any sort of malware or malicious processes that are run. And what I mean by that is, a company may have a server that holds a database of 2 million client records, and maybe it contains HIPAA protected medical data. And just because that system is compromised, it doesn't guarantee that from an obligation standpoint, a notification has to go out to each and every one of those clients that were contained in the database, because the records may not have actually been compromised, and by that I mean viewed or exfiltrated from the system. So what Gilware does is we take the broad range of data that is potentially exposed to the attacker, and we use digital forensic artifacts from malware reverse engineering to things such as memory analysis to determine exactly what was viewed or transferred off the system to reduce sort of the amount of records that were compromised and then the actions that have to be taken subsequent to determining that. Are we still on?
Hello? Yeah, Dave.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, my phone was on mute here. My apologies. What I was saying to myself apparently was that the point you made at the very end there, Nathan, about environments that maybe have been compromised, but we don't necessarily have a legal obligation because you could determine what files were accessed or not accessed. I think that raises some interesting points that I'm going to ask Eric and Steve to weigh in on just a little bit. But I want to let Steve have a chance to introduce himself, give a little information about what he does, and then we'll be able to go on from there. So Steve, your next step, what role do you play in a breach response, and why do we need you on our team?
So I do a number of things. I help with the communication during the crisis. And one of the things that my company provides, we do rehearsals and prep for these sort of things. So we do some of the things, to determine, who should be on the team and what their roles are and kind of staying in their lanes on when something does happen. But when a breach happens or when a significant incident happens, I work with the company or the individuals to determine, the communication, both internal and external, the messaging, talking to the board, talking to investors, the staff, vendors, the media, the public. And then we talk about what to say and what not to say. And that's always a crucial part too. Sometimes the danger isn't not saying, but saying way too much, especially when things are in flux and the information may change or may not be exactly accurate. And then so not what to say, what not to say, and then when do you say it? And then who says it? The gut reaction is perhaps to have the CEO come out and make a statement. But when you have the CEO make a statement, then it's a sexier story, frankly, and it might become page one, and that's the thing you don't want. So we talk about timing, what to say, what not to say, when to say it, and who's best to deliver whatever message is at that time.
Okay, excellent. I'm excited to dig into more of that in just a little bit, but before we move on from this, I wanted to bring up that point that Nathan made about, say you have an environment that has been compromised, but there hasn't necessarily been an access of, a hacker was not able to access, say, personal health information or payment card information. They got into the network, but they didn't get to the crown jewels, so to speak. Eric, is there legal implications that they may have, even if those crown jewels aren't breached, so to speak? And building off of that, Steve, how would you recommend a company that's in that position handle that situation? Do you think they should even announce that to anybody? You don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, proverbially, even though this might not be a molehill. So I kind of want to help. I want to ask you two to unpack that a little bit. So Eric, we'll start with you.
Sure. So typically, well, now all 50 states have data breach notification laws. They're all slightly different, but most of them say you have to notify individuals if there was an unauthorized access or exfiltration of their personally identifiable information. So the notification statute is not triggered until that happens. So if there is an infiltration, but it's certain that they did not access or exfiltrate personally identifiable information, then there's no legal obligation to notify individuals. If there's no legal obligation, while there might not be a legal obligation, you might want to do it for other reasons. You might not. It all depends on the situation. The other thing that comes to mind is if you have contracts with vendors or customers or anyone, that access might trigger a notification within that contract you have with a third party. So while you might not have to notify individuals based on the data breach notification statutes, I would recommend that you check your contracts, excuse me, that you have with other third parties to see if you have to notify them in case of a breach.
Okay, that's a very good point to make, to review not only your legal obligations from a regulatory perspective, but your contractual ones as well. Steve, what do you think about that? Is it worth notifying customers and employees and all those folks if the crown jewels haven't been taken? I guess in both the short-term and a long-term perspective, what do you think about that?
Yeah, what I would do in a situation with that, and some of this would really depend, each individual's situation is different, but there's different groups and different audience that should be contacted at different times. The situation like this, I think I would contact the board of directors. They are ultimately in charge, and let them know that something's happened. And then I would let staff know, but I would do it in a very, disarming way, saying, we've had this situation, but we're working on it. Doesn't seem to be much. And then most importantly, in communication, people want to know that there's a vision. They want to know that whatever has happened, as long as there's a plan to address it, the stress level goes down, the comfort level goes up. So if you say we've had this, but we're doing X, Y, and Z to address it, but again, we want to, keep we want to keep the communication lines open. We want to let you know. But I always stress with clients is to make sure that all communications have a futuristic vision on how you're going to address whatever it is. And if people know that there's a plan, then they go on to the next thing. It's when they feel like they're either cornered or they don't know what's going to happen, the anxiety goes up, and whether it's vendors or clients or whatnot. But as long as they have a plan moving forward, again, it's just it's a good practice to have communication lines open.
Okay. Steve, I'm going to hang on one point that you just said, having a futuristic vision. That's a really great, I like that phrase. And we're going to use that to transition to our next section here. How should you actually be preparing for an incident? We'll spend other time talking about how to deal with the aftermath, but things that we can do on the front side to prepare for an incident here. So having futuristic vision and helping envision what could happen is going to help here. So from a crisis management and the communications perspective, how can companies prepare for a pending crisis? And this is certainly applicable to a breach, but could be for any kind of crisis, certainly.
Sure.
What sorts of things should they be doing on the front end?
And I've dealt, and you and I've talked about this in the past. I've dealt with all sorts of things, from embezzlement to murders and suicides and all sorts of different things that happen on premises. So some of these things aren't unique to a data breach, but most importantly, you need to know who's going to be in the room. You need to know who is going to be on that team. Who from leadership, who from IT, who from, HR, who from communications, and make that determination on who's going to be the decision makers when the crisis happens. Once you make that decision on, we've decided here are the 4 or 5 or 6 or people that should be in the room, then you go into the silos and who is responsible for what, who's going to let the board know, who's going to work with IT, who is IT going to report to, and what's the expectations of how often they report. And so it's the master plan, the right people are in the room, the doors close, and then it's determining what their roles are, who's going to gather the information, who's going to gather the statistics, and then who's going to be the spokesperson, who's going to have all of those different roles. Once you determine who's in the room and what their roles are, and then kind of what I call staying in your lane, making sure that you're in charge and you're working on the things you've been assigned to and not worry about some of the other things that other folks are working on. And that gets very tempting in a crisis situation on why isn't so-and-so doing more, or how come we're not doing X, Y, and Z. So once we have the right people in the room and the assignments done, then we can move forward on, the solutions. So those are really the baseboards of making this happen. And when I work with companies, especially companies that aren't prepared, they can spend an awful lot of time just determining who should be in the room. They can spend a half a day saying, do we need so-and-so, and should we have so-and-so? And then they could spend a half a day figuring out what their roles are. And by then, you know, the media may have already had it. Somebody from the company may have leaked it, or a vendor or someone, and then you're really kind of chasing your tail. So being ready on the front end is just crucial.
Yeah, and especially in an active breach situation, and I think Nathan can probably shed some light on this. Minutes matter. The hours matter. If you know somebody's in your environment, and you have a bunch of people in a conference room trying to figure out what to do, you potentially have a bad actor in your network exfiltrating information, all while everybody's sitting there trying to figure out, okay, well, who's going to lead here? And you don't want to be first identifying a leader in the incident. You should be identifying them ahead of time. I think that's a really good insight, Steve.
Absolutely. Yeah. And let me just jump in real quickly on that. Yeah. You know, ultimately, and the people on this call, you're in the back of your mind, you're thinking, how do I protect the brand? I mean, this could cost, not only time matters, but dollars matter. And this could cost you, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some instances, millions of dollars if it's not done correctly. And I use, you know, some of the better known ones that didn't do it right, like Target. I mean, that cost them hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, I think I saw the figure yesterday. I think 252 million was the figure. Yeah. And Target had purchased 100 million of cyber insurance, so they took it down just a little bit, but still not an easy pill to swallow for any organization. Right. Nathan, pivoting to what you do in your world, Nathan, what are some things that companies can do to prepare themselves from an IT security perspective?
Yeah, you know, obviously training has already been mentioned, that being employee training of the actual end users, how to identify suspicious activity. So that's extremely important. But some of the often forgotten aspects of preparing for a potential breach, because unfortunately we live in a world where security incidents are almost inevitable for companies. You know, hopefully it's a small incident and not a large scale incident, but most companies have dealt with some sort of incident, or maybe they've had an incident, and even worse, they don't know about it. But in preparing for an incident, working with your IT department or your IT vendor, and possibly a cybersecurity professional or a digital forensics professional to prepare your systems to be logging the correct data. And by that I mean, if your network is set up to log the vast majority of network traffic, it's set up to log file access, it's set up to track file changes, and if all of those things are in place, the breach response from a digital forensic standpoint becomes much easier to prove absolutely that certain data was not compromised, you know, maybe to the level where you can notify clients of a security incident, but explain how prepared you were to handle it, and how you can say with absolute certainty that no data was compromised. And obviously the notification isn't really my realm of things, but the pre-breach preservation of data and the post-breach preservation of data are something that we get involved in often. It's already been said that minutes and hours matter, and that's certainly true for the preservation of data. The decisions made in regards to the systems involved, whether it's an individual employee's workstation that was the root cause of the breach, or if it's a server that may have had ransomware, what's done with those systems and the logs associated with the systems after the breach is extremely important. A lot of times people will have an instinct to say, you know, this workstation, it just got infected with ransomware because of a malicious email attachment. Let's securely wipe this system to prevent it from ever being plugged into the network and spreading the ransomware attack. At the surface, that seems like a good response, but that's actually a bad response, because you're overwriting a lot of the evidence of the breach. And when you do that, especially in HIPAA situations that are a little bit more strict, if you don't preserve that data, it can be impossible to prove that data wasn't exfiltrated, and your only option may be to notify all of your clients of a potential breach. We've seen every end of the spectrum. We've been called into security incidents from very large enterprises, and you can tell immediately, either when I'm brought in on a conference call, it's either a conference room that's full of their breach response team already, and then I know that they're already in pretty good shape, and they're bringing me in to just kind of advise on this type of breach. Or the call is the flip side, and the call starts with, 3 months ago we had this incident and now it's an entire disaster. We need to try and save face. And we've had companies that have unfortunately, it's such a disaster that they've just thought it's better to, claim bankruptcy rather than deal with all the fines they're going to experience. So largely that preservation of data, both setting systems up to preserve data beforehand and afterwards, are very important steps in a breach.
I can imagine in the first conference room where you're brought in and the team's there, that's where you're needed. In the second conference room when they're looking ashen and they say we had a breach 3 months ago, they need Steve in the room more than they need you at that point, because it's not going to go well.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a PR disaster at that point, and digital forensics can still help in some scenarios in that point, but a lot of times it's not going to go well no matter what, because we're not going to have access to the data that we need to do our work.
Yeah. Eric, Nathan brought up a point that I'm hoping you can unpack a little bit through as you're telling us about preparation points that clients should consider. But Nathan was talking about how take a HIPAA environment where you have protected health information. In that situation, if we can't expressly prove that data was not accessed, do we have to assume that it was then? And then does that put that client in a position where they could face HIPAA fines, for example? Or is it a guilty until proven innocent type situation? Or how does that get handled? If you could address that, like I said, as well as a couple of points that clients should be doing to prepare for potential incidents.
Yeah, for HIPAA, there are the OCR is the Office for Civil Rights, which is the department within HHS that's responsible for HIPAA, has laid out factors that you need to go through to determine that. So that's pretty well prescribed for HIPAA. But it's just like everything else, you have to make a reasonable determination. But there are specific factors within the OCR that show you how to do that. But on a bigger scale, the question, how should you prepare for breach? To me, the answer is basically the same as how you prepare for anything, and that's through practice. So if you want to become a better baseball player, you practice. If you want to become a better chef, you practice. If you want to get better at responding to a breach, you practice responding to a breach. And there's many ways you can do that. The most common form is to a tabletop exercise, which basically means you just go through the simulation of you have a breach, a pretend breach, and you go through the steps. Typically, you'll have an incident response plan that forms the framework of that tabletop exercise, and the purpose of that tabletop is to find the holes in your plan so that when you do have a live incident, you can patch up whatever holes exist in your plan to make the live event run a lot smoother. That to me is probably the best thing you can do. You can just do it informally internally. You can hire third parties to come in and actually perform the tabletop. That can be expensive for some people, but it really is worth it. So I would recommend practicing through tabletops. The other thing I think, and Nathan touched on this, is early detection and initial reporting. The Poneman report that you referenced earlier, David, also showed that the earlier you detect the breach, the cheaper it is to recover from it. The cost per record goes down pretty significantly the earlier you detect it. So again, training your employees on what to look for. If they give up compromised credentials in response to a phishing email, they need to tell somebody right away. The other thing is I handle a hotline, data breach reporting hotline, and believe it or not, we see a ton of lost and stolen laptops. A lot of people think that breaches are caused by, state actors and persistent threats. And while, yes, absolutely, that happens all the time, you would be shocked at how many breaches are just caused by, human negligence. You lose a thumb drive that didn't have a password on it, or, you lose a laptop. So training employees on physical security as well is important.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I would just want to add to the discussion regarding tabletop exercises that you just touched on. I was at a conference probably about 3 months ago, and one of the attorneys who runs tabletop exercises really stressed the point that you need to have them often, at least 2 to 4 times a year. More often is better. But make sure you have different people in the room each time you do it, because you could have your core incident response team, but if Bill's on vacation and Jane's on maternity leave, they're not going to be in the room when the breach happens. So you need to have people that are their backups and their backups go through those incidences as well, so that you've got as big of a knowledge base as you can, no matter when a breach happens, because you're never going to have exactly all the right people there at the right moment, because that's just, life doesn't work that way sometimes. I think, yeah, perfect. So now we're going to spend a little time. I just want to dig into each one of your areas just a little bit and ask, what's going on in your world. We've talked about, how this all applies to breach response and cyber risk and things like that. But I want to, like I said, I want to give each of you an opportunity to say, okay, what are you seeing today? So we're going to start with Nathan here. What sort of network incidences are you seeing these days? And by seeing, I mean, what's most common, and then at the same time, what is the most destructive or the most overwhelming things that you're seeing on a regular or semi-regular basis in your world?
Yeah, so obviously the one that nearly everybody's heard of at this point is ransomware, and that's still a very common security incident because it has been so lucrative for cyber criminals, and it's also very noticeable when it happens because your data gets encrypted. Other security incidents, such as credit card skimming from web applications and keyloggers that just monitor every keystroke on your computer, sometimes those go undetected forever, so they don't appear to be as common as ransomware, although those are malware just like ransomware is, so they are very common. So ransomware is a very common case that we deal with because ransomware is one aspect of a security incident. Most oftentimes ransomware is just one part of it, and there's something bigger going on, and oftentimes the ransomware will be used at the end of a security incident to kind of cover up and distract from some other action that was taken, such as data exfiltration. So ransomware is common.
No, go on.
Business email compromise. I'm not a big fan of acronyms, but if you see the acronym BEC, that stands for business email compromise, and that's basically the phishing attacks or some other way where somebody compromises your email account and usually uses it to send emails with your real signature on them, but they're malicious emails from an attacker to everyone in your contacts list to try and compromise new accounts or distribute malware. And if I had a public service announcement that I could get out through this webinar, it's when your email is compromised, you almost immediately get replies or calls from your clients saying, hey, I think you have a problem with your email. And everyone almost has the same reaction. They say, oh no, I got to change my password. And that's great. Changing the password is great. But every time that we see an email account compromised, we almost always see other things other than the malicious email being sent out. And especially for Office 365, what we see is the attacker will set up email forwarding rules so that all of your inbound emails are forwarded to their own email account. So even after you change your password, they continue to monitor your email account. And that's can be a disaster because then they can see exactly what's going on and can use it for further attacks. So if your email's ever compromised, give us a call or look for email forwarding rules. Real quick here, the other common instances are types of attacks we're seeing are web applications exploited and credit cards and other financial information being stolen, and then remote access to systems being exploited. If people work from home and use remote desktop, that can be exploited if it's not set up properly, and somebody can gain just access to the computer just like they're working from home, just like an employee does. So those are probably the most common ones we're seeing today.
Okay. Nathan, can you tell us a little bit about how digital forensics professionals will interface with in-house IT? I imagine there's probably some people on the webinar right now that are saying, well, we pay 4 or 5 IT people that manage our systems. Why can't they focus on this? I thought that's what they were supposed to be doing. What does digital forensics bring to the table that maybe in-house IT doesn't? And are there different goals that each one of those two professionals might have?
Yeah, the biggest thing, there's a few advantages. One of the biggest advantages to bringing in outside incident response professionals is your IT department, thankfully, isn't seeing security incidents and breaches every day, whereas cybersecurity professionals, we are. So we know what things to look for that have happened in similar breaches. And we work very closely with IT departments, and many IT departments are very good. So we leverage the IT departments as much as possible to reduce costs. But there's some things, mostly perspective, that digital forensics providers can really bring. And the other thing is, from a PR perspective, many of our clients really see an advantage in the attorneys and the PR specialists that we work with to, in that notification saying that we brought in Gilware Digital Forensics, they did a full analysis, did this summary report about the incident to make sure that your data wasn't actually compromised. And that gives people a little bit more peace of mind to know that, okay, the internal IT department, which likely can do good work, but might be a little bit biased, where we're completely unbiased and just look at the facts of the case and report on the case. So that's kind of the biggest differentiator that we have between internal IT.
Okay. No, I think that's a good point to make. I've had the discussion with clients a number of times, so it's good to kind of know where that line gets drawn and what responsibilities each one has. Eric, I want to pivot to you now, and I want to know what you're seeing in terms of requests that government is making of companies or regulators. Obviously, in your role as counsel, you're going to be interfacing a lot between the client and government officials. When they're coming in after a breach, what sorts of questions are they asking you about the target of that breach?
Well, they want to know. They want to know that cybersecurity is part of the culture of the company. Usually if a regulatory agency is involved, they're there to potentially fine you or give you some sort of sanction. And so one of the best defenses to that is, look, nowadays we know that even the most, alert companies and sophisticated companies will get breached. So what they want to see is that, you are taking cybersecurity seriously. One of the ways to do that is through employee training. They want to see that cybersecurity is not just one of these, once a year we'll do, a 20-minute presentation and then we'll keep cybersecurity off the table until next year. They want to see that you're doing regular training, that, you're accountable. So one of the best things there to do is just to, make a file about what you're doing. Be able to show and prove if somebody comes to you and says, what are you doing, to protect your sensitive information and the sensitive information of your customers? You'll be able to rip off, 20 things. This is what we're doing. This is how much money we're spending. This is the time we devote to it. Because ultimately, if they do levy a fine or a sanction, it will be less. If you can show them that, look, hey, we take this seriously. This was, for example, this was a human error. Somebody was having a bad day, and they clicked on a business email compromise, phishing email, or they gave up their credentials in response to a pretty sophisticated phishing email. They're going to go way easier on a company if they know that, look, this company takes things seriously, as opposed to that company that just is completely lax, doesn't care about cybersecurity and doesn't invest the time and money into strengthening their posture.
Mm-hmm. You know, I had a friend of mine who's an attorney, and he said that one of the first things he learned in law school is that if you don't document it, it never happened. So having that file is going to be absolutely critical if somebody comes knocking on your door there. So
right.
thank you very much.
Yeah, let me just supplement that real quick. And you know, the first thing that they're going to ask you for is all your policies and procedures related to cybersecurity. So along the lines of document it, make sure you have written policies, make sure you have written procedures, and make sure you implement them.
Okay, good deal. I just got a note from one of our webinar directors here. I'm not sure I announced it at the beginning of the webinar, folks, but we do have a spot on the right side of the screen. If you have questions about anything you're hearing, or you want to, we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end here. So feel free to use that chat feature. You can input your questions there, and then at the end, we'll take a couple of minutes to address those questions as well. I just want to make sure that message gets out there. So thank you, Rachel, for pointing that out. Finally, Steve, getting back to crisis communications and what you do, what are some of the biggest mistakes that businesses make regarding communications regarding an incident?
There's a number of things, but the one that I see the most is that they tell too much information, and the people on this right now go, what do you mean by that? And I've seen it. In fact, it recently happened. I was working in a case, and one of the companies had a really poor quarter, and they were doing an interview, and in the CEO, they asked about the financials, and he said, boy, we had a really bad quarter. And then he said, boy, but you should have seen last quarter and the quarter before that. And there's just this gasp in the room that you need to answer the question that's asked and make sure it's truthful and it's accurate, but don't answer questions that aren't asked, because when you do that, I mean, you're digging a hole, and you know, the rule of thumb is when you're digging a hole, the first thing to do is put down the shovel. And so that is one of the things I see, is the answering way too much information. You know, you need to be precise, you need to be accurate, you need to be honest, but adding information when it wasn't asked is really dangerous, and especially when you're not used to working with the media.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of being questioned by media or by anyone really, what questions do you see media asking in a press conference after a breach? And to that point, should you even be doing a press conference? Should this be a 4:30 on a Friday afternoon kind of story, depending on what's going on, obviously? But you know, what sorts of things does media want to know after a breach?
Sure. It's along those lines. I was the deputy chief of staff in a governor's office, and the rule of thumb is governors deliver good news, and secretaries of departments and deputy chiefs of staff deliver bad news. And so along those lines, there's timing on who delivers the news, and especially depending on how bad the crisis is, what's going on. And then there's strategic timing as well. If most newspapers put the weekend newspaper to bed on Friday, and so in most television stations are very minimally staffed on weekends as well. So if you can wait, depending on if this is an ongoing thing, there's some strategy on when you announce what you need to announce. Press conferences, I tend to suggest that they don't do that. That makes it a bigger story and a more reportable story. A press statement with a few facts, and again, what you're doing to resolve these issues is something that I would recommend. But I wouldn't do a press conference. That's just asking to be on page 1 instead of page 7. But there's strategy on how you say it and who says it. It's a much less likely reportable story if you have the VP of HR stating some of the things that are going on. That makes it less attractive because it's not someone of a big title. So there's strategy on when you do it, on how you do it, and who says and what they say. When I work with clients, we talk about this a great deal on who's going to be the spokesperson, what they're going to say, how they're going to say it. I always stress you have to be honest, but with that caveat, answer the questions that are asked.
Yeah,
hey, David,
absolutely.
This is Eric. Can I jump in real quick?
Please, yes.
I just wanted to get Steve's thoughts on this. So one of the things that I saw a lot in dealing with, PR folks. And one, I think that an important feature of an incident response plan and how to prepare for an incident is to have what's called a media holding statement. And this is one of these sort of pre-prepared statements that basically says, we're aware of this incident, we're actively investigating it, and, we'll get back to you when we have more information. Because I think in my experience dealing with breaches is you're never going to win the game of why didn't you tell me sooner? And Steve alluded to this as well. It's like you never want to speak too quickly, because if you say something that turns out to be inaccurate, then it just looks like you don't know what you're doing. And so one of the things that people can do is, like I said, prepare one of these media holding statements, and just wanted to get Steve's general thoughts on the appropriateness of that.
Absolutely, and we do that, and I'm glad you brought that up. But we do that as common course. Yeah, I call it having it in the top right-hand drawer. It's your go-to if you need to have it. You have something prepared. It's probably about 90% ready to go. You might have to tweak it depending on what's happening in real time. But absolutely, that way you have the statement that leadership and others have already approved. It's ready to go, and you can send it out in real time without giving a ton of information. But the worst thing you can do is tell the press or even your employees, we can't tell you. We have no comment. That makes it either they get angry or they feel like you're hiding something. So if you have a prepared statement that says, we're working on it, absolutely, and that takes down internally, it takes the stress down, but externally, these reporters are on deadlines, and so even if they have a quote from the company, or if they have something, or they know that is being worked on, that very good point, and we do that as common course.
Steve, that's it's relevant. We're talking about this right now. The first question came in here, and the question is, how should I communicate internally to my staff prior to a press release? How does communication sound? What should the messaging be to employees versus to the press or to outside sources?
Sure, and it's very different. You have to understand, though, and you have to prepare. Whatever you send out probably is going to go public. So they're going to send it to, their aunt, their uncle, they're going to send it to their kids, they're going to send it to their buddy who's a reporter, whomever. So whatever you put out, just plan on seeing that again. Having said that, the communication internally, again, you throughout the year, you tell your employees that they're part of the team and they're valued and so on and so forth. So you do, they will feel like at least they've been briefed and they either haven't been tricked or haven't been left in the dark. But, again, with that prepared statement, you can have a prepared statement, one for external and one for internal. And the internal one can be very vague, but, we're working on it, but we wanted to let you know what happened. And, we have, here are the things we're doing to address it. And but we just wanted to keep you, briefed on this, this minor situation.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of leads down to the idea that if you care for your employees, they'll care for your customers. So if you give them some attention and let them know ahead of time, they're gonna represent the company in a better way too. So there's a lot of value there. Being cognizant of the time, you forgot about. Oh, sorry, you're gonna say something else?
Oh, just one other thing. There will typically there comes a time when you give people speaking externally the talking points on here are the 3 facts. So when they are talking to vendors, when they're talking to clients, they have something prepared so everyone stays on message. But again, with the stress that with the media, there's only one person that should be talking to them, and often attorneys will put some language in there just saying, boy, if you talk to the media, just so you know, there might be some legal ramifications of this, and that tends to make them very nervous on talking to the media as well, and that's really what you want. You don't want people talking to the media that shouldn't be talking to the media. Okay,
absolutely. We got another question in here, and we're just going to jump right to the Q&A portion because they're coming in pretty good here. This next question is for Nathan. Nathan, can you speak more to common network incidences, and are there red flags for my company that my IT team can take care of? I guess, how would a company, what I take away from that is, how would a company recognize that there is an issue going on? And what are some good action items that you can give to in-house IT teams today to help them prepare for this and be more aware of a possible incident? And what's the first step that they can take to help mitigate that? besides call you?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's such a wide range of incidents. There's no kind of one catch-all. Obviously, I already said the business email compromise is easy to detect, but the more network compromise, especially the web application servers, can be a little bit harder to detect. Having a really great firewall in place to not only prevent attacks, because the modern good firewalls, FortiGate is one, there's many out there, will prevent a lot of attacks, but they'll also send alert notifications to your sysadmin or a sysadmin group when suspicious activity is going on. And there might be some false positives in there, but it at least gives you something to tell you if something suspicious is going on. But really, any unexpected activity or unexpected reports. So say you're getting reports that, customers are reporting that their credit card is stolen, or we had a CPA firm where they noticed that when they were trying to file tax returns for their clients, that they were reporting to already be filed. So it's a lot of times, setting up network monitoring and SIM tools, security incident and event management tools, is important. But listening to suspicious reports and activities from the real humans that are interfacing internally and externally from your network is the best way to detect issues and figure out if there's something that needs to be dug into deeper.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Nathan. One last question that we got in here relates to the question is, how do you identify and vet service providers like all three of you? Obviously, we certainly trust Steve and Nathan and Eric here, but for an average everyday business, the question is, how do you identify and vet these services? And one of the ways that that's done is if you're a policyholder for a cyber insurance policy, if you actually have an incident that pops up, if you have a ransomware attack or you're notified that you lost customer information, whatever the incident actually is, when you report that to your cyber insurance carrier, they actually have all of these service providers on panels ready to go so that they can jump into action the moment they're notified of a claim. You don't have to open up the yellow pages and find them for yourself. So in the event that this actually happens, sort of the flow that happens is you'll notify your carrier, and the carrier will then bring in a breach coach. So somebody like Eric. And Eric is going to be the one that would quarterback the entire response as well as provide legal assistance with his background as an attorney. Eric would then likely bring in somebody like Nathan on the forensics IT side to do what Nathan does. And then if the situation calls for it, that's when Steve would be brought in for the crisis communications piece. So thankfully, that's one of the things that makes, so what was that? Oh, I thought that somebody said something there. So that's one of the things that makes cyber insurance a little different than other types of insurance, is that carriers take a very active hand in helping you respond to a claim. So certainly you can reach out to any of these folks here, but if you are a policyholder in cyber insurance, a lot of these services would be provided to you already here. So with that, we are just at about our 10 o'clock time here, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know that we're going to have more questions that arise after this webinar here. I'm sorry I couldn't give our panelists time to give some final thoughts, but if you do have additional questions for them, please email us. Cassie Hopkins, the webinar manager, will be sending out a copy of the webinar, and you can submit additional questions, and I'll make sure that they get to the proper panelists so we can continue that conversation. So with that, I want to thank Nathan. I want to thank Steve. I want to thank Eric as well. Cassie, do you want to wrap us up here?
Absolutely. So thank you all for attending today's webinar. We're so glad you could make it. We're going to be sending out a short survey and would appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. If you have a question for David or any of our panelists, as you said, we are going to send out that contact information in an email, and that will also have a link to the recorded webinar and a PDF of the slides. Our next webinar will be on October 18th, and that will be on ensuring risk with Diana Schmidt. She'll be talking about the complex and nuanced world of insurance and when deciding when and when not to insure risk, and we hope you will join us. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time.